welcome everybody. Glad to have you here. We are live on X today, formerly known as Twitter. This is a way for us to connect with each other live in real time. It's a place for Kennedy supporters and the Kennedy curious, Kennedy campaign volunteers and staff to get together and talk about the issues, what's going on in the news, and anything else you want to talk about. I love these live spaces because it lets us interact with one another in real time. We do repurpose these after the space ends into a podcast. And that podcast goes out to a variety of different platforms because not everybody uses X. A lot of people don't know how to use X Spaces. So we like to, get it out there on other platforms like YouTube and Rumble and all the various podcasting platforms so that everyone can enjoy it. And if you're not already, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/@, got to get the little @ symbol in there, at Kennedy Americans. And you can also subscribe on Rumble. I recommend Rumble because, of course, YouTube likes to censor Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and they have actually removed several episodes of this podcast. So if you want every single episode going all the way back to day one of the campaign, we were there in Boston last April 19th, and we've been covering the campaign every step of the way. We usually put a new episode out every week. You can find those only on Rumble because other platforms have in fact censored several episodes. So I would encourage you to please subscribe to the Rumble channel. That's at rumble.com/Kennedy Americans. The press conference that Bobby had in New York last week in Brooklyn, where he showed the results of the Zogby poll that showed that President Biden is actually the spoiler in this race and that he can't beat Trump. And that if it were a race of RFK against Trump, then things get interesting, right? So I wondered when I saw that. My first question was, okay, looks good, but let's just say that Joe Biden, for whatever reason, can't finish the run. Maybe he has a medical emergency. Maybe he decides to just withdraw before November. Question is, would it be before the convention, at the convention, or after the convention, right? That's where it gets really tricky. I don't know if you guys can hear me or not. I'm getting a message that my connection is lost. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. If the DNC, if Joe Biden withdraws as the nominee, the DNC still has to, from their own bylaws, they have to nominate a candidate. I mean, they're not going to sit out an election just because their nominee has decided to withdraw. So it would either be Kamala Harris, or if it's before the convention or at the convention, they're going to have to nominate somebody other than Joe Biden. So the two-man race scenario in that Zogby poll just didn't make any sense to me because there will be another candidate in the race. If it's not Joe Biden, I mean, the Democrats are going to run somebody. So I can't really see a scenario where it would be RFK versus Trump in a head-to-head race unless, and this is a big if the Democratic Party delegates at the convention drafted Kennedy, right, and chose him as the nominee. Now, I think the superdelegates would block it unless there are some negotiations happening behind the scenes that none of us know about, where some of the Democratic Party power brokers might be dangling a carrot to Kennedy and saying, hey, we're not sure Joe's going to make it. He's very unpopular. Would you be interested in the Democratic nomination? Which is hilarious to me because that's a long way from where we were last spring and summer and fall when the Democratic Party was doing everything they could to rig the primaries to make damn sure that Kennedy wouldn't be the nominee. We could have told him a year ago that Joe Biden was a terrible candidate, right? Maybe it just took them this long to realize that Joe Biden can't win. They're going to have to nominate somebody better. Obviously, Kennedy's better, but it's real hard for me to see the Democrats actually nominating him as their candidate. What do you guys think? Any thoughts on that? Anybody?
Lori, I love that. I hadn't heard that scenario laid out there. That's so funny. Yeah, it doesn't
I
seem,
guess it could
it
happen
doesn't,
theoretically.
it's theoretical for sure. It just doesn't seem, it would be like if they want to beat Trump, then look, yeah, uh, Kennedy beats Trump. Um, and so they should be considering that, I think. And but yeah, how far is that? Yeah, I just go back to what Dennis Kucinich said. The Democrats would rather see Trump win than Kennedy because that's who they're paid for. That's where their money's coming from. So yeah, we'll see what happens. But if they're really serving the interests of the country and they believe in their platform, they should be considering what you're putting forward there.
And I wonder, guys, if that should happen, let's just play with that idea for a moment. Let's say that, the Democratic convention this summer had a draft on the floor and actually, by some miracle, nominated Bobby Kennedy. If he went back to the Democratic Party after going independent and making a big show of breaking the two-party duopoly, and then he goes back to one of the two big parties, do you think it would cost him votes? Do you think that people might feel betrayed, that I thought you were a real independent and now you're a Democrat? I would never vote for a Democrat. What are your thoughts on that? Anybody? How about Billy Dees? I haven't seen Billy come up to stage yet. Hello, my friend.
Billy.
How's everybody doing? I'm hope you're having a good evening. I'm going to say I've been saying this for 6 months. Vivek is with me on this. I heard him give an interview a week or two ago where he on no uncertain terms says Joe Biden is not running. Joe Rogan is predicting that it's going to happen this month. Last I heard in May. I would say it's probably going to happen before the convention, only because the time from convention to election is like lightning speed, and they're going to have some damage control. They're going to want to, make their candidate seem solid and legitimate. And that's going to be a very short window to do that. And I think you really need the energy of the convention. I think you need the bump that the convention usually gives candidates in the polls. So here again, I don't have any firsthand knowledge on this, but if you've looked at some of the gaffes that Joe Biden has done, you're talking about somebody that would have to be president until 2029. All right. And that's if he can get elected. The polling,
What a scary thought, man. That's what keeps me up at night.
yes, and some of the studies that I've read about said that he's got the lowest ratings of any sitting president at this point in the election in 70 years, and no president has overcome that in terms of getting elected again. When they've been this low several months out, it hasn't been overcome. So if you're a Democrat and you're serious about winning the election, there's pretty much no option here. It has to be somebody else. I'm going to say no to Gavin Newsom. It's possible he's a very skilled politician, whether you like him or not. Very skilled politician. But I think he's got problems of his own. He's got some real problems in California right now. He's a very polarizing figure, and to put someone like that in months away from the election, I'm going to say probably not. Now, who they're gonna come up with, I don't know. I would say it's probably going to be somebody who's moderate left as opposed to center right. I think they have to get a little bit more moderate. And somebody like Tulsi, I'm not saying Tulsi, but somebody like her, with those kind of polling numbers and with that kind of an image, that would be a real problem for both of Trump and RFK, and I'll tell you why. Trump in particular, the Republicans are counting on the anti-Biden vote. They're counting on the person that says, "I've had enough of this." They're counting on the person that's saying he's not capable of being president, and that is a big crutch to lean on. If I was working for the Republican committee right now, or if I was working for RFK, I would be getting a contingency plan together. I'll get a marketing plan together that's ready to hit the road, because if this does happen, and I think it's very possible, LBJ did it. LBJ said, I won't accept and I won't seek my party's nomination. Now he did it earlier in the election cycle, but it's very possible to do that. And that would not mean that Kamala is the default. That's only the default if he resigns as president. So it could be a very interesting time period that we're moving into here. And I would be very cautious of a major change in the Democratic Party, especially after Memorial Day. That's my 2 cents on it, Lori.
Always interesting to hear from you, Billy Dees. You have an excellent grasp of politics and how it works. And, the shades of Jimmy Carter. This reminds me so much of the 1980 presidential campaign. And it's ironic because Bobby's Uncle Teddy was the one who was challenging the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, who was exceedingly unpopular. A lot of people saying that Carter wasn't fit to lead, wasn't fit for the job, wasn't up to it. And we had a crisis in the Middle East with Iran going on during that election cycle. We had the hostage crisis where they were holding, 44 Americans hostage. So it's interesting how it mirrors what's happening right now. We currently have American hostages being held by Hamas in the Middle East on Joe Biden's watch. And he doesn't seem to be doing much to get them back. It's funny. We never hear about the hostages. Well, it's not funny, but it's just strange that, I remember in the summer of 1980, in the fall, and leading up to Ronald Reagan's inauguration after the election, how the media talked about it every single day. Every newscast had a little chyron down in the right-hand corner saying, hostage crisis, day 100 and something or other. Just to remind people every single day that, we've got American citizens being held hostage in God knows what conditions, or if they're even dead or alive, or what's been done to them by their captors. And yet everyone's so quiet on it this time. And Joe Biden certainly is quiet about it because it's an election year and he's old enough to remember how that hurt Jimmy Carter. A lot of people believe that the hostage crisis is what cost Jimmy Carter the 1980 election. Of course, he had a lot of other problems too. The economy was in the tank. He had problems out the yin yang that year, but the biggest problem he had was the hostage crisis and the Iran crisis. And I guess that brings us to the other direction that Bobby Kennedy's getting attacked on this week, as usual, as it's been since October the 7th of last year, is Gaza. This week, of course, it's constant attacks from the left, especially on Kennedy for his support of Israel. I wanted to share with you guys an interesting story. Yesterday, I went on a podcast to defend Bobby's position on the Middle East, to defend his Middle Eastern policy on a very far left wing podcast. Craig Pasta Jardula, who some of you might know from the Convo Couch or as a fill-in host sometimes on the Jimmy Dore Show. Craig's a friend of mine, and he was all in for RFK. At the beginning of this campaign, he was very excited about Kennedy, and I'm sure you guys have heard many stories like this. He was all in for Kennedy until October 7th, and Kennedy tweeted out that he supported Israel in their war against Hamas. And that, Craig says that cost him his vote and his support for Kennedy. So he invited me on his show yesterday, and we debated Gaza and Kennedy's position on Gaza for a good hour. I'll take that portion of the debate. I know some of you will be interested to see that. Here in the next few days, I'll post that up to my YouTube channel and let you guys know about it if you want to take a look. But, it was interesting because I was going into a hostile environment with a crowd that was very pro-Palestine. And they're very angry at Kennedy over his support of Israel. And others are just baffled by it. They're mystified. They don't understand why he's not, quote, on the side of the Palestinians, which again is a skewing of what he's actually said. It's misinterpretation of what he's actually said. And I think that some of them are doing it in bad faith when they say that he's a baby killer, he's a genocide supporter, he loves watching innocent Gazans die, he supports a Nazi regime in Israel. I mean, they just go to the absolute extreme on it. And then I ask them, well, have you actually heard what he said? I mean, have you listened to his interviews? Have you listened to the podcast he did called The Path for Peace, where he listened to both sides? And in his interviews, he's always really clear that he's pro-Palestinian. He's on the side of the Palestinian people. Of course, he doesn't want to see babies killed. Of course, he doesn't want to see the slaughter that's going on and the airstrikes and the tragedy of it. But it's far more nuanced. And again, I keep coming back to that word, nuanced. Everything in the Middle East crisis, that conflict is very nuanced. It's not something that you can come to understand from watching a quick TikTok video or listening to a podcast. You've got to spend years and years of your life reading books on it and really taking a deep dive into the history to truly understand what it's all about. And that's why I agree with Bobby. And I don't have any trouble at all going on a podcast like Craig's and facing a hostile audience and trying to educate them as to what his experience actually is. His position is very clear. He supports the Palestinian people, the innocent civilians who are caught in harm's way. But he puts the blame on the appropriate party, who's actually their oppressor and enslaver, and that is Hamas. It is Hamas who has kept them in that open air prison. It is Hamas who failed to build bomb shelters for their people before they started a war on October 7th, knowing full well that Israel was going to retaliate. I mean, they've been dealing with Israel for years. They knew what to expect. You don't just cross Israel's borders and go on a killing spree and expect not to get any slap back. Of course, you're going to get slapped and slapped hard. What would the United States have done had our borders been violated in that way? Had our citizens been murdered in that way or taken hostage or both? You know what we would have done. We would have bombed the hell out of whoever did that to us, and quickly and thoroughly and for a prolonged period of time. So, you know, he blames Hamas for the oppression of the Palestinian people. Now, maybe people listening to this right now support Hamas and think Hamas is not doing anything wrong. But what they did on October 7th was wrong. What they've done to the Palestinian people for decades is wrong. That's what Bobby argues. I agree. And he's been very, thorough and nuanced and caring in his approach to the Palestinian people. Never once has he said that he supports a genocide. Never once has he said that they deserve what they're getting right now. But, again, this is a long history that a guy like Bobby does understand. He understands it better than most because it's touched his family in a very, very personal way. His father was assassinated by a fanatic, a Palestinian terrorist, who was angry at Robert Kennedy for his support of Israel during the 1968 campaign. And because Robert Kennedy, as senator, voted to send Israel 50 Phantom jets for self-defense. And that's what triggered Sirhan Sirhan to go into his killing spree. Also, some of you may know this, some of you may not. Bobby's older brother, Joseph Kennedy, who was a former congressman from the state of Massachusetts, in 1973, 72, I believe it was, he was on a flight that was hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It's a Palestinian liberation terrorist group. And in the early 70s, they were on a hijacking spree. Some of you younger folks might not remember a time when flights were routinely hijacked. This was a common occurrence in the 1970s and 1980s when we didn't have the kind of airport security that we do now and passenger screening. But back then, flights were routinely hijacked, and they were usually done by the PFLP or PLO associated groups, all of them doing it in the name of Palestine, taking hundreds of innocent people hostage. Sometimes they killed the hostages. So Bobby's brother Joseph was on a flight that was hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in 1972. He was lucky he lived through that. In that situation, they did let the hostages go unharmed at the end of that long ordeal when the flight was hijacked and diverted to Yemen. But, obviously he's got his reasons, perhaps you might argue, for not being a big fan of the Palestinian liberation movement, because they are associated with a long, long history of terrorism, of hostage taking, of murder, including the murder of his father. So it's kind of a touchy subject, to say the least, in the Kennedy family. And, Sirhan Sirhan will be coming up for parole again. He's just turned 80 years old. He turned 80 in March. I know that some people say he did it. Some people say he didn't, that somebody else actually pulled the trigger. I know that Bobby's changed his mind on that a couple of times in his lifetime, and so have I. I've been studying the case since the 80s. 1988 was when I became interested in the RFK case. Been studying the JFK case for over 40 years. And I used to believe that Sirhan may have been a mind controlled patsy. I believed that there might have been another shooter. And I just recently went back and did a long review of all the evidence in the case that was presented at Sirhan's trial, because we just had the 55th anniversary of his trial. It was a 4-month trial in 1969 from January through April. It was a very public trial, public spectacle. Some might say a show trial. But Sirhan, confessed both at his trial and many times to journalists over the years of his long incarceration that he did it, and he'll tell you why he did it. He did it because he was angry at Robert Kennedy over his support for Israel. He wanted to do something big for Palestine. Sirhan is regarded as a hero in Palestine, within the Palestinian Liberation Movement and their allies. And in fact, during those hijackings of the 1970s, on several occasions, the hijackers demanded the release of Sirhan from prison. They wanted him to come home to Palestine, where he would receive a hero's welcome for killing Senator Robert Kennedy. He is revered as a hero in the Palestinian Liberation Movement. So make of that what you will. But with the situation in Gaza and tensions being so high about this topic right now, I'm concerned for Bobby's safety. I think it's an extremely unsafe environment for him to be on the campaign trail without Secret Service protection. Thankfully, Gavin DeBecker and Associates are rock stars at security. They've done an amazing job at keeping him safe. I mean, a Kennedy running for president or any elected office is always going to attract the crazies. And this campaign, as you well know, has certainly attracted some mentally unstable people who have shown up at his house, who've come to his events heavily armed. He's in danger, guys, and we all know that. But then you throw a war in the Middle East on the fire, and things get even more intense. Not just the attacks on Kennedy because of his position, his policy, but just because he's the son of Robert Kennedy, because of that whole Israel-Palestine conflict that led to the murder of his father. And I see Jay's got his hand up. I know this is a topic he's passionate about. So Jay, take the mic and let her rip.
Hey, what's up, everyone? So, you said a lot over there, Lori. So I don't want to, harp on all the points, but I just wanted to ask you a quick question about October 7th. Knowing how advanced Israeli surveillance is, on the Palestinian territory, if like, do you think that the response that they've had since then, which clearly benefits, their ultimate goal of getting the land for themselves. Like, do you really, just looking at how it's played out after the fact, do you really believe that even if they weren't responsible for the idea, which I don't think they were, but even do you really think that Hamas could have pulled that off without, you know, Netanyahu and the Israeli government knowing what was going on? They couldn't have prevented it, in a more substantial way. And I don't know if you've actually seen any of the interviews that have come out, with actual Israeli soldiers, about the response. But, they openly talk about how, that day when they were out there, they were told that, it's better to kill Hamas members along with fellow IDF soldiers than to, let them get away with the hostages. I don't know if you've actually taken the time to look at the events of what occurred that day and put that in context of the overall situation, but I just find it so hard to believe that Israel could not have stopped the events from playing out the way they did, because their response time was so delayed that day. When they have the Palestinian movement under surveillance, they have had it for a long time, and we know, because of things Netanyahu has said publicly and privately, that he wants, like Hamas to be funded. Like, and, I remember you said earlier that you think that they were trying to buy peace, but it if that was what they were doing, then they wouldn't have assassinated and locked up all of the moderate Palestinian politicians that wanted to actually learn to live alongside Israel and make a longer lasting peace. So like from when you look at the overall context of the situation, like Israel is the country with the power. They're the ones who don't allow the Palestinians to have their own state, with an official army and control their own borders. So, like, given that whole context, do you really believe that Israel, who has such tight control over the situation, could not have prevented that many people from dying that day? And do you really think they didn't have a hand in some of those deaths? Do you really think the Israeli soldiers that died that day all died because of Hamas, or do you realize that the IDF was involved in a fair amount of that death and they were out there shooting everybody? Like, I don't know, have you researched the events of October 7th at all?
Oh yeah, a lot. And I apologize, guys. Jay, I missed a lot of what you said there because the space just crashed on me. My whole Twitter app just crashed. I got kicked out of the space. I had to reboot Twitter and get back in. So I think I heard enough of what you said to kind of get the gist of your question about October 7th. And I agree with you. I mean, I have a lot of questions about what happened on October 7th too. Hell, I still have questions about what the hell happened on 9/11, and that was like 23 years ago or 24 years ago. So I
Exactly.
really don't know. I mean, I can tell you this. Here's what I do know just from studying the history of U.S. Israel relations and our intelligence relationships in the Middle East. We have, as we all know, I think most of you know, that for a long time, the United States and the CIA has worked with terrorist groups such as Al Qaeda. We worked with Osama bin Laden. We worked with Saddam Hussein. They were our friends before they were our enemies, right? And we have indeed worked with Hamas. We have propped up Hamas. The United States has always had kind of a two-fisted policy when it comes to the Middle East. In principle, we support Israel, and we have since 1948, because obviously after World War II and the Holocaust, we felt that it was the right thing to do to give the Jews their own country, their own state, and that it was the principled thing to do. You have to put yourself in the mindset of 1948, having just learned about the horrors, the true horrors of that Holocaust. And to realize that, a lot of people say that Israel exists today because of the Holocaust. There's truth in that. But let's also remember that the Holocaust happened because there was no Israel. The Holocaust happened because Jews had no place to go. They were cut off in Europe. They could not escape. For a while, in the early 30s, there was the Havra Agreement, which is controversial in some places. The Havra Agreement was for Zionist Jews who wanted to escape Germany. And honestly, if I were a Jew in Germany in 1933, I'd be thinking about getting out. I'd be thinking about leaving. I don't know about you. I would definitely get the hell out of there if I could, if I were Jewish. And a lot of them were Zionists who felt that call to go back to their land in the Middle East, their ancestral homeland. That was the Zionist movement. And for a while there, the Nazis let them leave. They had to pay through the nose and give up damn near everything they owned to get out of the country. But they were allowed for a few years to escape to Palestine and find safe haven there. Mind you, this was at a time when Great Britain wasn't taking them, the United States and Canada weren't taking them. Like, borders were closed to them all over the world. So Palestine was one of the few places where they could find safe haven, but it wasn't really safe because then they get to Palestine and they're being constantly attacked by the rebel Arab groups who were hostile to their presence. Those groups were led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, that you've heard me talk a lot about if you follow my podcast, Haj Amin al-Husani, who was then the leader of the Palestinian resistance. And there was a kind of a civil war going on between these groups in the years leading up to World War II. I should point out that back then, the Palestinians were part of an alliance with Nazi Germany. There was an Arab Axis alliance. And the main reason they joined forces with Hitler was that they didn't want the Jews in Palestine, of course. They endorsed Nazi Germany's, shall we say, race and religious laws, things like the Nuremberg laws. They wanted Jews to be second-class citizens, and they endorsed the final solution. They wanted the Jews eradicated from the Holy Land so that it would remain their country. So to bring things up closer to the present day, when you understand that history, you also have to understand that the United States has allied ourselves many times with terrorist groups in oil-rich Arab countries. Now, why do we do that? We say we're Israel's friend, and you see it right now in the Biden administration's approach to handling this war. On the one hand, he claims to be a friend of Israel, supporting Israel in their time of need, but at the same time, he's holding them back from going into Rafah, trying to exercise control of the hostage return and the ceasefire agreement. And it seems that he's playing both sides. And that's always been the United States policy in the Middle East. Why? It's really quite simple if you boil it down. And I'm just going to quote the words of John Loftus, who's a legendary Nazi hunter in the Justice Department back in the 1970s. He's the one who uncovered the documents proving that the United States brought Nazi war criminals over from Germany and Ukraine and Belarus and put them in positions of power in the military, in NASA, and in the CIA. He's actually a hero of mine, one of those great whistleblowers. He's the reason that we have the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 that gave us the documents proving that we brought literal Nazi war criminals into our government, usually under cover of the CIA. So here's what John Loftus, who's also an expert on the Middle East, has to say. And he knows what he's talking about. The reason that we betray Israel time and time again and sell them out to the terrorist groups that are looking to destroy them is real simple. Israel doesn't have oil. The Arab countries have lots of oil. It's all about the oil. Every war in the Middle East is about the oil. And our foreign policy is about the oil. We've always not wanted to offend, or rather bend a knee to the oil-rich Arab states. And right now, they're kind of winning this thing. Hamas is doing pretty good in the eyes of the international community. They're winning this thing. They're winning the propaganda war. You know, Israel is facing war crimes charges. Netanyahu himself may be found ultimately to be a war criminal. And, you know, Bobby is not a fan of Netanyahu. And what I would also like to point out is that Israel is a very robust democracy, very much like the United States. Some might argue that they're an even greater democracy than the United States. When you see the civil unrest, the protests, the demonstrations, you can go, you know, to Tel Aviv and you'll see posters all over the place of Netanyahu as a war criminal. You know, posters depicting him with blood running down his teeth, eating a baby. So that sort of speech is allowed in Israel. They have a very free press. And this kind of, you see the protests in the streets right now against Netanyahu calling for him to resign. So it's not like that in Palestine, though. They don't have any freedom of speech. There's no freedom of the press. If you demonstrate or oppose Hamas, they kill you. That's how it works. You know, if you're gay, if you're a woman, if you're not a Muslim, you're going to have a really difficult time of it in Palestine. If you are Jewish, you're definitely not welcome in Palestine. And that's why, you know, people say that Israel's a white colonizer state, that all the Jews in Israel are white people and they're oppressing the people of color, but it's not true. The fact is that Israel has over 9.2 million citizens. 2/3 of them are people of color. There are 2 million Arab Israeli citizens who have equal rights. They vote. They serve on the Supreme Court. They serve in the Knesset. They have the same rights as everybody else. That's what the Hamas propaganda machine doesn't tell you. And that is a very effective propaganda machine. And that's why I say that right now Hamas is winning the war, at least on social media, because they have so many repeaters and propagandists who aren't telling you the whole truth. The whole truth would take years of your life to discover, because this is such a long and complex conflict. The Jews and the Arabs have been fighting each other for thousands of years in the Middle East, and no American president can solve it, guys. Robert Kennedy can't solve it. Believe me, every American president has tried to solve this crisis, and it's not even their crisis to solve. And yet, the best role that we can play as Americans is to be a mediator between the two parties. But no, we can't force our will upon them. And a lot of people think, well, why doesn't Joe Biden just tell them to settle down and stop shooting and have a two-state solution? It's not that simple. Believe me, they've tried that. They've tried it many times since 1948. The Palestinians have refused their own state on like at least 5 different occasions. Jay asked me before, like, well, why doesn't Israel give them a state? It's not in Israel's power to give them a state. That's more of an international decision, or a decision that is usually brokered by a third party, such as the United Nations or even the President of the United States.
But they trying to do that in 1967 though? Remember the 1967 borders that was agreed upon that Israel rejected?
Well, yeah, but there was a war about that in 1967. I mean, a lot of people talk about the stolen land narrative, and I addressed this yesterday on Pasta's show. If you start a war with your neighbor and you lose that war, you're going to lose some land. Okay, that's how wars work. You're going to lose some land if you're the loser of the war. That's what happened in 1967. After the
Yeah.
war, the winner of the war that you started a war with is under no obligation, nor should they, return any land to you that you lost because you started a war.
Yeah, but my only point is that you said Palestine is turning down offers of their own state, but they've never actually been offered the chance to fully control their borders and their immigration policy. What they keep being offered is like the equivalent of the Native American status, within America. So they're not really being offered like their own state in any of these deals. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that they've turned down, those offers because, like I said, that's just not like what's happened because that's not a separate country. That's like a mini sub government that's ultimately still answers to Israel. So, until they're able to, like, I think the phrase "from the river to the sea" gets confused because I consider myself a free person. I'd want to be a free person anywhere in the world, and right now, the reason why Israel cannot be described as a democracy, like a better description of it would be like some kind of ethnocracy. But what I mean by that is you can't actually marry, have interreligious marriage in there because they don't want more Muslims to, be part of Israel. So, and they've specifically contained the immigration strategy where they only allow in a certain amount of non-Jewish people, like every year. So
Can
it's
I
specifically
explain
designed
why
to
they do
have.
that? I'd like to explain
Yeah,
why they
no, I
do it,
mean,
if
yeah,
I could.
sure, you can respond afterwards, but like I think the overall point that people need to realize is for you to call a place a democracy, that means you have to look at the democratic rights of everybody within that territory. There's no Palestine on a map. It's just Israel. And right now the majority of people inside of the place called Israel cannot actually vote. So
But they
they're
do
one of
vote.
the
That's not
worst.
true.
No, no, no,
Where
no.
did you
The
get that?
Palestinians don't get a vote. The Palestinians don't get a vote in Israeli
Well, no,
elections, but
because
they
they're not
don't have.
Israeli citizens. You have to actually
Yeah,
be a
but
citizen of
they're
a
under
country to vote
Israeli
there.
territory. They don't have an internationally recognized country, and they're under Israeli
They
territory.
have
That's
their
why when
own,
we,
yes, they do, Jay. They have Gaza and they
but
have the
but no,
West Bank,
but
and
no, they don't.
they vote in
No, they don't
elections in
because they don't
Gaza,
have control over
not
their
Israel.
own borders, Lori. Lori, they don't have control over their own borders. They don't
Borders have
control
nothing to
what
do with
comes
the
in and out.
election, though, Jay. The elections,
But
they
Lori,
are separate
they're not an
entities.
independent sovereign nation, is what I'm saying. Like every country has the right to establish what it wants to do for defense. Like I was born in Jamaica. the relationship between Jamaica and America is different from the relationship between Palestine and Israel as far as how our governments can influence each other. So to
Okay, I'm
describe
going to have to
Palestine
stop
as an
you right there.
independent
I'm
state
sorry, Jay.
is not a way to like
I'm sorry, Jay. I have to mute you because you're kind of all over the place. So I had to mute you. I'm sorry, my friend. I have to address a couple of points. Gaza has their own elections. Hamas was elected to represent the Gazan people. A lot of people say, and they misunderstand the situation. They say, well, Palestinians, they don't get to vote in Israel. Well, no. If you're an American citizen, you can't vote in Mexican elections. If you're Mexican, you can't vote in American elections, okay? You have to be a citizen of the country. I have friends, I know people who are Israeli dual citizens, but even though they live here in the United States, they have citizenship in Israel. They're not allowed to vote in Israeli elections, even though they're citizens of Israel. But you're only allowed to vote in Israeli elections if you actually physically live in Israel. That's just their law. That's the way it is. Now, if you live in the West Bank, you can vote for your leaders. That's why you have the Palestinian Authority, who's elected by the people in the West Bank. That's why you have Hamas, who's elected by the people of Gaza. They have their own elections. These are separate entities. You can't call them a state. You know, there's not full Palestinian statehood, but they have their own elections. They elect their own leaders. Of course, they don't vote in Israeli elections. They don't live in Israel proper. They're not citizens of Israel proper. However, any Palestinian, after, you know, just as you want to become a citizen of the United States, you have to apply, you have to go through a screening process. They have to make sure you're not a terrorist or a criminal or a bad person. That's the orderly and legal immigration process to become a citizen of any country. In that sense, Israel is no different from any other country. You know, it's
so
important
Lord,
to
would you
point
say the
out,
Native Americans
if
have their
you
own
just,
country though?
okay, stop interrupting me. I'm going to have to mute you again. After 1948, there were 160,000 Arabs in that area of Palestine as it was transitioning over to the state of Israel when Israel was created. 160,000. That number has grown now to more than 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. They were given the choice in 1948. You can either vacate or you can stay. If you want to stay, you become an Israeli citizen and you take a loyalty pledge to be loyal to your country. Now, it is important to point out that Israel, you know, there's mandatory, compulsory military service for every Israeli citizen, except Arab Israeli citizens. There are some religious exceptions also for certain Jews. They're excused from compulsory service. And I can see why they do that, because there might be some questions about loyalties. Now, there are a lot of Arabs serving in the Israeli military, and they're some of the most loyal of soldiers, very loyal to Israel, very proud to be Israeli citizens. And ask an Arab anywhere in the Middle East, what country do you want to live in where you're going to have the most rights? They'll all tell you, if they're honest, Israel, because that's the true democracy. That's where you can actually have some rights, not so much in other parts of the Middle East and other Arab countries. So it's not, I don't understand why people have this idea in their minds. It's, again, it comes from Hamas propaganda, but it's just not true. They say that, you know, Arabs can't vote in Israel. Yeah, they certainly do. And a lot of them are Palestinians. And they have chosen to take Israeli citizenship. Now, if only it were that simple. When you look at things like, you know, look at it from the point of view of the United States. Let's take a hypothetical situation. Let's say that for 80 years, Mexico had been hostile to us, and that for 80 years, and we'd fought several wars with Mexico over that 80-year period, all started by Mexico. Let's say that Mexico was constantly firing rockets into our country, which is what Hamas has done since they came to power in 2005. Folks, the rockets didn't start flying at Israel on October 7th of last year. This has been going on ever since Hamas came to power. There were 5 ceasefires in place prior to October 7th. Hamas broke every single one of them by firing rockets into Israel. Now, I don't know about you, my fellow Americans, but If Israel did, sorry, not Israel, if Mexico did that to us, ceasefire after ceasefire, starting war after war after war, constantly attacking and killing our people, waging an intifada against us, not once, but twice, of terror attacks, killing our citizens. I wouldn't just fling our gates open to the south and say, come on in without a security clearance. No, of course we're going to check you out. Of course you're going to, you're going to go through some checkpoints to enter our country. And I think that's a very sane policy. That's how you protect your citizens. And the job of government is to protect their citizens from outside hostile forces that wish them harm. This really doesn't seem so controversial when you look at it from the point of view of, would any other country tolerate it? Would the United States tolerate it? Of course we wouldn't. And of course we would screen carefully. If the country next door is full of terrorists who want to kill you, it would be very smart to check them out before you let them in, And I know there are a lot of people here in the United States who want to secure our southern border for that very reason. We've had guys getting across our southern border who are not only MS-13, and I know Muriel knows all about that, gang members, but we've also got people on the terror watch list getting into our country right now. That's really not a good idea. I'm just saying. I think that Israel has every right to control their borders. And by the way, there's a reason that the borders are closed in Egypt to Palestinians. There's a reason that Lebanon and Syria and every other country in the Middle East is not opening their arms since October 7th and saying, we'll take the Palestinian refugees, come on in. Because there's a long history of Palestinian refugees coming into Arab countries and committing acts of terror and assassinations. They literally assassinated the king of Jordan in 1951. He was shot by a Palestinian. Palestinians have caused misery and trouble. Not all Palestinians, I'm talking about the Islamists, the terrorist groups. And they'll attack Arabs just like they'll attack Jews. They go into other Arab countries and they do acts of terror. They've come to the United States and visited terrorism on our shores. They've hijacked international flights full of innocent people. Okay? At some point, you have to stop looking at terrorists as nice guys, because they're not. They're terrorists. I'm sorry. I don't have a lot of sympathy for a terrorist who would cut your fucking head off to look at you, who would kill your kid right in front of you. That's what Hamas did on October the 7th. And there's videos of it. These guys were so heartless. They literally pulled out their GoPros and live streamed the murders that they committed, the rapes that they committed. I've seen that 47-minute film. I got access to it as a journalist and I watched it. And I'm sorry I did, because I'll never sleep again. And for all of you out there who think that terrorists are nice guys and that we should appease them and negotiate with them, you need to really study some history, guys. Because when you negotiate with terrorists, you get more terrorism every single time. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. They just do. I'm not sitting here defending Netanyahu or the Israeli government. I'm not a big fan of them either. They've done some terrible things through the years. But that's the bottom line. Whatever you would not tolerate in your own country, then don't hold Israel to a higher standard. And it's the height of hypocrisy for the United States, who bombed the hell out of Baghdad and Iraq for 20 years, and Afghanistan and Vietnam and Korea and a long list of countries for, in my opinion, no good reason. Okay? I don't support those wars. I haven't supported any war since World War II. I think they were illegal, unjust, immoral wars. But we were attacked on 9/11, and somebody had to pay for that. But it turned out to be more complex than we thought. It turned out that we emboldened and funded the very terrorists who came back to bite us. We funded Al-Qaeda. We created Osama bin Laden. The CIA did that. So 9/11 was kind of the chickens coming home to roost. And again, it gets back to my point of negotiating with terrorists. And I'll tell you a story to get this back on the subject of RFK. I was telling you earlier about the hijackings that the PFLP was doing in the 1970s. You know, there was also the Munich Olympics of 1972 when they took the Israeli team hostage and killed them, and killed a lot of police, and it was a crisis that was felt around the world. Most of you probably aren't old enough to remember it. Those of you who are old enough to remember it will never forget it. But also, you might remember in 1973, some of our older listeners might remember when the Black September group, which was the same Palestinian terrorist group that did the Munich Olympics, a year later, they broke into the embassy, the U.S. embassy, or sorry, it was the Saudi embassy in Khartoum. And they took 9 diplomats hostage. I believe 3 of them were Americans. And they demanded once again the release of Sirhan Sirhan, murderer of RFK, from prison. And they said, give us Sirhan Sirhan and we won't kill the hostages. Well, Nixon was president at the time, and he said, nope, I don't negotiate with terrorists, and you're not going to get your Sirhan Sirhan. And so they killed all of the hostages. Not only that, they tortured them for hours before they killed them. When the bodies were found, they were not even recognizable. They had to be identified by their remains, and they showed signs of horrific torture. I'm telling you, terrorists are not nice guys, you know, and we've seen this strange phenomenon since October 7th, right? You see people out there watching TikTok videos, reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America and going, oh, wow, he's so cool. He's such a nice guy. No, he's not. Okay. He's a terrorist. What is wrong with you? You see them out on the college campuses right now, literally screaming. Some of them, not all, but some of them are like, I love Hamas, you know, globalize the intifada. Do you even know what intifada means? It's literally a campaign of terror and murder. And it's a bad, bad thing. Terrorists are not nice people. And if you're supporting terrorists, I don't know what to tell you guys, but it's just not a sane thing to do. So on that, I'm going to go ahead and end this space because I've got to get on. I've got some stuff I got to do tonight, and I don't want to sit here and debate Gaza for the next 4 hours. I do watch my debate with Craig Pasta Jardula, which is more specifically to Robert Kennedy's position on the war. And why he supports Israel. I see that there are a lot of folks out there who love Hamas and want to argue with me, but I'm just not in the mood. I have debated this one to death this week, and I said what I wanted to say. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us for the Kennedy Americans podcast, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Good night, everybody.